I have a problem. Chris built a bed, but to be honest, I think he cut some corners. Don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful bed, but it feels like he forgot one thing. Nightstands. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit. In reality, we designed and built both of these pieces together. And it's actually the first time we've truly done this. Sure, we have pieces that complement each other, like the long view table and chair, but those were designed independently and just work well together. We have the Pico console and wall organizer, but the console was designed first, then the organizer was designed to complement that. And we have the Glen lounge chair and ottoman, which were actually designed years apart from each other. But in this situation, we really wanted to design two pieces simultaneously that could stand on their own, but were also clearly meant to be together. You can see it in a bunch of different ways when you look at the two pieces. Things as obvious as the fact that they're both made of white oak, some of the more general design aspects like the shape of the legs, and all the way down to some of the smaller details like the roundovers that transition into the flat surfaces like the headboard and drawer front. And we're really proud of how they both came out. Alright, obviously there's a lot to cover with this one, so I'll get into more detail as we move along, but for now, let's get to work on breaking down some lumber for the small box that's going to house the drawer. I'm making the box out of 4/4 lumber, which is milled to about 3/4 of an inch thick, and I'm going to be using miter joints at each corner so that I can create a continuous grain wrap around the top two edges. Doing this takes a bit of organization, but I feel like building a box of this size is really manageable, and it's such a great skill builder. Trying to cut accurate miters on the ends of long boards in order to make big boxes can be tricky. So if this is something you've been wanting to get the hang of, building a box of this size can really help get the techniques dialed. And if this piece looks like something you'd want to build to learn some of these techniques, we have full plan project courses available for this and the bed, and honestly the other pieces that I was just talking about, all available on our website, and I'll put a link to those in the description. So obviously, to build a box, we need to make some panels that are wide enough to get the depth of the cabinet we're shooting for. And at this point, I have one long panel and one shorter panel for each of my nightstands. The reason for this is I need to get the top panel and two side panels from the same board to get that continuous grain pattern I was talking about, while the bottom panel can really come from anywhere because you won't see it once everything's been assembled. And the lumber I was using was full of cracks and checks, so I didn't really have the option to get all 4 panels of the box from one continuous board. Though the front edge will still be visible on the bottom panel, so I need to make sure it matches to an extent. Alright, now that I have a couple panels ready to go, I can start marking out where I need to cut them in order to turn this one large board into 3 smaller sections. These crosscuts are pretty critical because in order to get a really nice grain match around the joints, I want to remove the least amount of material between the 3 sections as possible. So I'm first going to crosscut the large panel to break it into 3, then start cutting my bevels and just try to hit that edge I just cut. I'm also going to use a technique that I talked about in one of our previous tips videos. Go check that out if you haven't seen it yet, where I set my blade just past 45 degrees, which is either 44.9 or 45.1, depending on how you look at it. And what this does is ensure that my miter joints will be totally closed on the upper outside edge, which is the most visible part of the joint. And I'm going to go so very slightly past 45 degrees that when I glue up the box, you won't even see a gap on the inside of the joint. I promise it works like a charm. This step is also the point where I can dial in the exact desired dimensions of the box. And as long as I cut all the similar parts at the same time, everything will come out matching. So now that all the bevels are cut, I can first cut all of the panels to finished width, then get to work on the joinery. I'm using dominoes, but we know not everyone has a domino, so there are plenty of other ways to reinforce these joints. And honestly, on a box this size, glue alone will be plenty strong, so even the tape method will work just fine. We want these plans to be as accessible as possible, regardless of the tools you have, so we always try to show other joinery options besides the Festool domino. And we even created an entire domino alternatives appendix chapter that's tacked on to every set of plans that uses the domino. So with all of the mortises cut in, I like to give it a quick dry fit to make sure everything's coming together properly, and I can inspect those miters and see how perfectly they came out, even with my saw blade set imperfectly. Incredible. Alright, before I glue this thing up, there were a couple more items to check off the to-do list. I needed to cut in the front edge detail and a rabbet on the back edge for a back panel. For the front edge, I went with a simple roundover. This piece has a lot of curved edges, so I felt like these roundovers in different places kind of tie it all together. I initially started with a 1/4 inch roundover, but when I put the box together, I felt like it needed to be just a bit bigger, so I switched to a 1/2 inch radius bit and recut everything. And before I could glue up the box, I needed to cut in a rabbet on the back edge for a back panel. This is usually something I would do on the table saw, but I decided to do it on the router table since I was already mostly set up from doing the roundovers. And sure enough, I was getting a bunch of chip out, so I went to the table saw to finish the cuts. And sure enough, I should have listened to my gut. So after a fairly uneventful glue up, I had a full-blown box with some crisp and clean continuous grain miter joints, which meant part 1 of this build was in the books. So on to part 2, which was the legs/base assembly, which consisted of 3 parts: the legs, stretchers, and shelf. So let's start with part 2-3, then we'll move on to part 2-1A. Since the legs consist of 2 parts, so we have an A and a B. Okay, that's too confusing. Let's just start with the legs and we'll see where it takes us. And the first thing to do is trace out the leg shape onto some 5/4 lumber. And you might be wondering where this template came from. The nice thing about buying plans from us is that no matter what, we'll send you both SVG and PDF versions of all the parts in each piece that require templates. And if you want to cut out the middleman, which I guess is you can buy the MDF templates from us and we'll send them to you. So no matter how you get the templates, once I have them traced out, I can start rough cutting them. I like tracing parts like this with a Sharpie as it gives me a nice buffer to cut along, and it'll leave me just enough material to flush trim later, but not leave too much where I'm going to be struggling to remove it all. You'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. But before we do any flush trimming, I'm going to make a few cuts on the table saw. First to cut each leg to height, and second to cut the 2 joint faces on each leg. The cut on the top edge of each leg isn't a super critical cut, so I just used my miter gauge and set it by lining up the template to the table saw blade. Then I could just cut to the marked line on each leg. The rest of the leg is going to get shaped from there, so if it's slightly off, we really don't need to worry. So instead, we can worry about cutting the top joint face, which is where we'll connect the box to the legs. But don't worry too much, because a fairly simple table saw sled makes this cut easy and repeatable, which are actually 2 of my favorite characteristics of any table saw cut. So a couple blocks to act as a fence and a stop, then a quick hold down, since this cut would be slightly sketchy to do with your hands holding the piece, and I could make that cut on each leg. Once that was done, I could set up to cut the second joint face where the stretcher would be attached. And this one was a little trickier. I could get the sled ready to go in the same exact way as the last one, but as you can see, in order to make this cut, I'd need to stop the cut short, or else I would slice through the top end of the leg and ruin all of my hard work so far. The nice thing about this is that I didn't need to stop the cut at any specific point. It just needed to be far enough that I had a flat spot for the stretcher connection, so I could just kind of eyeball it as I was making the cut, and I knew I'd be good to go. At this point, the legs were shaped as much as they needed to be, and I could then work on the stretchers. The length of the stretchers is dictated by the size of the box, so once I had that measurement, I could add 25.4 millimeters to that, which would be exactly how long I needed to cut the stretchers.
25.4. It's an inch.
So after ripping some slightly oversized blanks, I could cross-cut them to length, then get ready to cut in some dominoes in order to connect them to the legs. I didn't have a ton of real estate for these dominoes, but I managed to stack two 5x30mm dominoes across the thickness of the joint, which I could then transfer to the leg side and cut those in as well. Before I glued the stretchers to the legs, I needed to rough cut the joint transition so I could use my template to mark this onto each blank. And I decided to make this template with only one end, which would allow me, and you if you decide to make this piece, to make the nightstands as wide, or not wide, as you want. So just by flipping it over, I could trace out both sides, then rough cut it on the bandsaw. And now at this point, I could glue these stretchers in place, and once the glue was dry, I could get ready to finish the final shaping on the freshly finished leg subassemblies. A few pieces of double-sided tape on both the leg template and stretcher template, and by lining up the templates to the reference edges on the leg subassemblies, I could get them in place and use a template bit to start trimming the last few edges that needed it. So by working my way down with the template bit, with the bearing referencing the template, I could trim each leg subassembly 1/2 at a time, then flip the templates to the other side and repeat. And once I'd gone as far as I could with the template bit, I finished off the cut with a flush trim bit in my router table. The last thing to do was sand the joint transitions nice and smooth. I like to leave a bit of extra material right at the joint line for fear of tear out, but then I can sand it down to its final shape. With the leg subassemblies to finish shape, I could work on getting the outside edge shaped as well. I wanted this to be a fully rounded edge, so by using a roundover bit that's exactly half the thickness of the legs, I could cut in a roundover from both sides of each leg, and that would result in a nice fully rounded edge. Then all I needed to do was cut the legs to finished height, and in order to perfectly repeat this, I set up a quick sled that had a spacer equal to my desired distance from the ground to the bottom of the stretcher, then another piece to sandwich the stretcher in place and hold the leg subassembly on the sled. Hey, real quick before we keep going, I want to thank Warby Parker for sponsoring today's video. So obviously around here we are all glasses wearers of glasses. Either way, we all wear glasses, and I've actually been wearing Warby Parker glasses for years now. Warby Parker is committed to providing exceptional vision care online and in stores, offering eyeglasses, sunglasses, eye exams, and contact lenses. And one of the things that first got me interested in Warby Parker is how easy they make the try-on and buying process. You go on their website, take a quick quiz, and they give you a bunch of options based on your answers. From there, you pick your 5 favorites, which they ship to you for free, and you can try them on at home with zero obligation to buy. One of the things I never enjoyed about buying glasses was having to try them on in a store with random people staring at me. So now I can do this at home with only my family staring at me. So here are the 3 pairs that we felt looked the best. Let me know what you think in the comments below. After you make your selection, glasses start at just $95, including the prescription lenses, and it's the great price coupled with the great buying experience that's kept me using Warby Parker for years. So if you're in the market for new glasses, definitely try Warby Parker's free home try-on program. Order 5 pairs of glasses to try on at home for free for 5 days. There's no obligation to buy, ships free, and includes a prepaid return shipping label. Try 5 pairs of glasses at home for free at warbyparker.com/4eyes. All right, thanks Warby Parker. Now, in order to turn these leg sub-assemblies into base assemblies, I needed to add a shelf and, of course, some more roundovers. The shelf was just a panel that I cut to length to match the length of my stretchers, and then cut to width depending on the look I was going for, since the width of the shelf will dictate how far inset the legs will be from the front and back edge of the cabinet. So once I landed on a 25.4mm front and back inset, I could cut the shelf to proper width, then cut the roundover on the top, front, and back edge, which I felt made the shelf feel a bit more integrated into the stretcher. And speaking of that, I could now permanently integrate the shelf with the stretcher by gluing them together. I had to be careful to line these up the best I could to decrease the amount of sanding needed after the glue up to get the shelf perfectly flush with the front of the stretcher, but besides that, this was about as easy as glue ups get. Once the glue had dried, all of the leg sub-assemblies were now base assemblies, but not for long, because the next step was to attach the box to the tops of the legs. And I found the easiest way to do this was to flip everything upside down and use some spacer blocks to clamp everything together just enough to hold it in place, but still allow me to tap everything into final position. I'm mainly trying to get the front and back inset as even as possible, as well as make sure the legs were as close to 90 degrees to the top edge of the box, and of course I wanted the bottom edge of the box to line up to the top of the upper leg curve. And once I was satisfied with the positioning, I tightened down the clamps, then started marking where I could pre-drill for some screws. I decided to use 3 screws at each leg and didn't add any glue. I was worried trying to get glue into these joints while moving around the box was just going to cause a mess, and the screws will provide plenty of strength for this application. So with a box attached to a base assembly, I honestly kinda had a nightstand. But I didn't want to just kinda have a nightstand, so I needed to make a drawer and a drawer front, which would obviously make it a nightstand. My drawer making technique is pretty much the same no matter what I'm making a drawer for or what drawer slides I'm using. For this one, I'm using Bloom drawer slides, so I first cut all of the drawer parts to rough width, then cross-cut them to final length. I like to cut rabbets onto the ends of my drawer side parts, which the front and back panel will seat into, and what this does is create a nice clean drawer side when the drawer is pulled out. So a couple cuts on the ends of each side part, and I have the rabbets ready to go, and I can cut each drawer part to finished width. Then I just need to cut in a groove around the perimeter of the drawer to accept a drawer bottom, and they were pretty much good to go. So with the boring part out of the way, I could start to work on the drawer front, which is way more exciting. On a small piece like this nightstand, the drawer front is naturally going to be a focal point, so I wanted to do something a little interesting, but not get too over the top and take away from the piece as a whole. So I decided to go with this simple circular recess with a single brass bar across the center to act as a pole. With a piece cut to fit my box opening, I could start to work on cutting the recess, and we have another template for this. I wanted to center this on the drawer front, so a few marks on both the template and the drawer front will let me line everything up and mark out the circle. With it marked, I decided to remove most of the material with a Forstner bit, so now with a good starting point, I could switch to a router and a template bit to clear out the rest of the recess. I needed the depth of the recess to match the width of the brass bar I was going to use for the pole, so I could use the depth stop on my router to set the exact depth by bottoming out the router bit, then placing the brass onto the depth stop, which I then locked in place. So now by lowering the router bit to that depth stop, I'll cut the exact depth of the brass. With the circular recess cut, I now needed to cut a groove so the brass bar can be set in place, and I was able to accomplish this on the router table by setting up a couple stop blocks that were placed so that when I pushed the drawer front to the left and right, it would cut a groove to the length I wanted, and I could do this cut in multiple passes until I was cutting as deep as the recess that was already cut. From there, I could cut the brass to match the length of the groove. Then I needed to round the ends to match the rounded ends of the groove created by the router bit. I did this on the belt sander, and since brass is pretty easy to shape, I was able to do it pretty quickly and accurately just by hand. Then just a touch of epoxy for insurance, and I could hammer the brass into place. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm really proud of these little nightstands and the whole set we created with the bed. They are pieces that look great together, but could also stand on their own, and I think they would look great in almost any home. Beyond that, what I might be even more proud of is the plans that we've created for both the nightstand and the bed, and all the other pieces that I mentioned earlier. When I got into woodworking, I wanted to make the best furniture that I could. And when I started sharing my woodworking knowledge with others, I wanted to create the most informative and digestible content that I could. And now that we're making these furniture plan project courses, I can truly say that we're doing exactly that. We put so much time and effort into these to make sure anyone that uses them will be able to follow along and make it through the build. And we're constantly working on ways to improve and tweaking small things to ensure they remain the best that they possibly can be. So if you've been considering trying one at all, give them a shot. I promise you won't be disappointed. Thanks for watching this one, and if you want to go check out the bed that I've been talking so much about, we're going to put a link right here. Go check out that video. It's just as good as this one.